First of all, a little pride from your guys yesterday?
First and foremost, ranking the 10 best games of the weekend, regardless of sports, seems a very thankless and a task that would make me just pull my hair out. Because honestly, especially on weekends like this, how do I include both F1 and Ohio State, Indiana in the same list? I think it's awesome, but where do I rank them? That would be very tough for me.
Wait a second. Did you say like Formula One?
Oh, that is definitely one of the 10 best sporting events this weekend. Absolutely, Las Vegas Grand Prix.
All right, you're gonna have to sell me. I'll give you 60 seconds to sell me on Formula One right now.
So imagine really good-looking athletes. If you are a female, they are all male. If you're into that kind of thing, whatever. But like beautiful people all over, both athletes and around the sport. Fast cars. These guys are fighter pilots. It's a really close race. Like. In the ultimate scheme of things, between three teams at the top, and the spectacle of cars going 200 miles an hour down the strip is one that is definitely worth checking out. It's awesome. It's an awesome sport. It's an awesome race, and I am fired up for it.
All right, is Lewis Hamilton still racing?
Lewis Hamilton is still racing. He's not racing well. Mercedes is struggling a little bit, but man. Lando Norris, up and comer for McLaren. Ferrari's right there in there. Lewis Hamilton's going to Ferrari next year. The biggest driver in the sport, maybe the history of the sport, going to the biggest team in the history of the sport. That's happening next season. But Max Verstappen and Red Bull are behind in the constructors. He's awesome. So there's just a lot going on.
So Roddy Jones, I'm going to change the intro now. Our ESPN college football analyst and Formula One analyst as well.
Don't threaten me with a good time. If I could be an F1 analyst, I would jump in a heartbeat. I would.
See, I agree with him because I love drifting, and that's kind of in the same network.
Oh, is it?
Yes.
I don't know what drifting is.
Formula One, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Drifting cars.
It's fine.
It's Tokyo Drift,
totally
and
understand.
Furious.
Totally understand. I could hook you up with Jamie Little. So if I'm sure she's covered Formula One at some point in her past. All right, so Georgia Tech actually looks like a good football team, Roddy.
Georgia Tech is a good football team, and what Brent Key has done there has been tremendous. They embody their head coach. They're physical on the lines of scrimmage, and those the last two wins have not been mistakes. And they've done it with a combination of a freshman quarterback that can throw but still learning the offense, makes freshman mistakes, and a quarterback who's in his fourth year in Haynes King that can't throw the ball further than 10 yards right now through no fault of his own. I mean, the kid had a shoulder injury and is trying to rebound from that. He has been as tough as anybody, but really the team around has continued to make plays. You saw yesterday a defensive touchdown on a pick six, another defensive interception that got Georgia Tech down to the 1 yard line, so they were able to punch it in, and you end up winning by 1 point. It was a true team win. And thank goodness for whatever win to push that 58-yard field goal wide, because it was a really fun game that was between two freshman quarterbacks ultimately down the stretch. So the future is promising for both teams at that position, but ultimately Georgia Tech are passing their win total from a year ago with a schedule that was undoubtedly tougher. Is tremendous for Brent Key in that program.
I talked about this earlier, and we're going to get into first of all, which game are you going to be at this weekend?
I've got Wake Forest, Miami, so I get to return to my roots. ACC country.
Look at you! We need Miami to kind of snap back into blowout mode. Not that I want you to have to deal with all of your filler material, but I do think that there's a conversation about how the ACC repairs its image within the sport that centers around schools like Georgia Tech, because there is football tradition at Georgia Tech. They have won a national championship. I guess they shared one, right, with Nebraska that year. But so it's one of those programs. It's not necessarily Clemson or Miami or Florida State or Virginia Tech, but it's right below that. It's in the next grouping of teams that if the league is healthy, if the league is good, then Georgia Tech is probably good. And it's good to see them playing not Paul Johnson type football. I'm not knocking it. It was gimmicky football. It's good to see them doing it, playing college football.
Yeah, I think your point about the competitive depth of the league is a good one, because you need two things. Like, you need teams to be good, and you also need them to be teams that you feel like you can trust. And when you have multiple years of a Georgia Tech being good, and then they, are making a bid to be in the top 25 or the top 15, you sort of believe that because you've seen the build, and there's some validity there that goes back to history. So, the stories of Indiana, a school with really no football history,
Right.
popping up and getting into the top five are rare, and they have largely done it because they have blown people out. What Georgia Tech has to do, a school that does have history, they've got 4 national championships. One of them was in most millennials' lifetime. That's a school that if you can sustain some level of success over the course of years and be fringe top 25 and then and a consistent bowl team and then break into the top 25, then you have that validity. And so, the SMU story is a great one, but I do think it hurts the perception of the league because we've seen what happens to G5 teams when they move up.
Right.
And so I think people are trying to sort of figure how much of this says great things about SMU and how much of it is a knock on the ACC after seeing UCF and Cincinnati and BYU struggle and Houston struggle in the Big 12 last year, and then seeing what Florida State is this year and seeing Clemson lose 2 games. Now look, Clemson's only lost 2 and the sky is falling, but lose 2 games and still look in some ways in a way that we have seen in the past, giving up big plays, the offense not looking like the Trevor Lawrence era, although I think we romanticize that a little bit too much.
We do.
So I think it's a little bit of everything. Even this Miami team has been romanticized a ton. Like, this is not a team that has blown really anybody out in ACC play. The Duke game ended up being a blowout. It ended up being a 3-touchdown game. But that's because Miami, who was losing in the fourth quarter to Duke, scored 3 straight touchdowns to end it. You've obviously got the Florida State game, and that's probably the biggest blowout that they've had. But Louisville was back and forth. Cal's, they needed a 25-point comeback. Virginia Tech is throwing a ball in the end zone to win it. So I do think there is competitive depth, but when Virginia Tech's hovering around 500, when Cal can't win an ACC game, and when Louisville loses to Stanford, it just sort of erodes any trust that you had in those teams.
Yeah, I mean, and that's what we're talking about. The reason, like, it's funny because when we talk about the college football playoff, and I know that the SEC and the Big Ten are going to try and essentially bully their way to 4 automatic bids for each conference. Like, this year, the SEC could be selling itself short. I'm a fan. I would be in favor of just the best 12 teams. I don't care where you come from. I understand why we're going to have automatic bids, which is, at least for the time being, to avoid a lawsuit, because you can't exclude the group of 5. There's no chance Boise State would be in the top 12 if there weren't automatic bids. I just don't believe there would be. But because I think you could have 5 or 6 SEC teams as the top 12 teams in the country. Based on what I have seen anyway. But we're probably not going to have that. I still think that Clemson has a chance as an at-large team, but it has to beat South Carolina next week convincingly, no?
I don't think Clemson has a chance as an at-large team because I don't think that I think when you look at where SMU is, like, SMU is behind Boise State right now.
Right.
I know, and it feels like Boise State is getting credit for playing Oregon close. Because or we are overvaluing the Mountain West, which I think it's a combination of both of those two things. You can't look me in the face and tell me that UNLV, who's at 22, I believe, this week,
right, who lost to Syracuse,
is better than the teams that just fell out. Kansas State, LSU, like that. I've seen LSU in person. UNLV is not beating LSU. It's just not happening.
Right.
So while I agree with sort of the assessment of the league that it is undervalued, I don't think Clemson has a chance. And I think the system that we have now is really interesting because the SEC is going to probably get too few teams in. And I agree, if it was just the 12 best teams, I think you could have an argument that 6 or 7, depending on how they finish, 6 or 7 SEC teams would belong in the top 12. I think that the Big Ten is probably going to get too many teams in.
Yeah, by two.
We'll see about Indiana tomorrow. But ultimately, all we know about Indiana right now is that they beat up on the bottom half of the league. So, like, Indiana could just be the 8th best team in the Big Ten. We'll find out. I think Penn State is probably a little overrated.
Mm-hmm.
Should they make a 12-team playoff if it was the 12 best teams? I mean, probably, but what have they shown this year to make me think that they are? They played Ohio State close. That's really it. You look at the USC and UCLA games, and there's no way that's one of the 12 best teams in the country. So it is super interesting. I would not be in favor of going to the 12 best teams because I don't need to see the 6th best team in the SEC again play Georgia. I just don't. But I do think that the Big Ten probably has the best. They've got the best setup because I've said Big Ten has a caste system. Like it's hard to break into that top tier. Indiana has done it, kind of. Again, we'll see.
Right.
But Penn State loses to Michigan and Ohio State when Michigan and Ohio State are better than them, and they beat everybody else. Happens every single year, like clockwork.
Yeah.
So the Big Ten is kind of in a place where they get credit for being a big-time league, but nobody upsets Ohio State. Nobody upsets Oregon. Nobody upsets Penn State. And when Michigan's good, nobody really upsets Michigan. And yet they get credit because when they beat up on each other, they play each other close. They get credit for a top-tier league, when actually I think the depth of that league is probably much more like the ACC than it is the SEC.
You know, what's really interesting, Roddy Jones is joining us here on the Adam Gold Show, our Formula One analyst, as we get ready for the weekend. The absence of divisions in the Big Ten, I think, is going to expose the Wisconsins and the Iowas of the world for being just okay. I've been screaming about this for a long time. I'm not saying Wisconsin wasn't good, because they were good, but they were never nearly as good as they seemed because there was nobody good in that division. And their crossover games, you know, a lot of times they would avoid the 2 or 3 best teams in the other division, Ohio State, Michigan. You know, I guess at one point Michigan State was good. Penn State, obviously under James Franklin, has been good, but they would avoid those. And for whatever reason, so they always had this incredible record, never played anybody outside of the league. So they'd have 10 wins at the end of the season. Go, man, Wisconsin's great. And like, have you watched them? They're just big. They're not great. They beat the other teams that aren't good. And I think the lack of divisions is probably going to continue to expose some of those teams that had good records without really being good.
I could not agree more. You know, there was a few years ago, I think it was 2 years ago, when you looked at the top defenses in the country, and like 5 of the top 10 were from the Big Ten West. And look, I'm not saying that they didn't play good defense in the Big Ten West, but there's no way that you can have 5 teams from the same division be in the top 5 in the country in defense unless the offenses are just terrible.
Terrible.
Like the Big Ten West consistently had 0 quarterback play and thus 0 offense. And so, yeah, absolutely, it is going to expose Wisconsin and Iowa and Minnesota and all of those teams. The only go back and look at for any listener who wasn't familiar with the work of the Big Ten West. Go back and look at the championship game scores. The champion of the Big Ten West over the last 5 or 6 years got beat 26-0, 43-22, 42-3, 22-10, 31-21, 45-24. There was a close one in 2017, 27-21. There was a close one in 2016, 38-31. But for the last 6 years, it has been blowouts, and the Big Ten West never beat the Big Ten East in the championship game. So yes, those teams absolutely are going to be exposed, and I think it's sort of made plain in front of our face just how big a difference it was, because, you know, I think it's going to be a while before you see a team from the Big Ten West finish higher than certainly 4th, although Indiana this year, I can't even remember whether they were in the West or the East, to be honest with you.
I think they were in the East.
They were a non-factor. Yeah, they were in the East. You are absolutely correct. They were a non-factor, so they're in the East too. But I think it's going to be a while before you see a former Big Ten West team peak into the top 4 or 5 of the Big Ten, especially now that you have Oregon, you have Washington, which is a perennial power, has history. We'll see what happens with USC. But those schools are going to continue to be exposed for what they are, which is like fine, but
right.
Never elite.
Yeah, I don't know if were they a legend or a leader. That I don't.
That's the other confusing thing. Like you go back to that, and then you get to Wisconsin, Michigan State playing in the championship game. Wisconsin, Nebraska.
Yeah,
that was a fun one in 2012. Like I completely forgot about that.
It's been a long time. It's been a long time since Nebraska played. No offense, a seriously meaningful football game. It has been a long time.
They may be playing in the next couple weeks if they can't get the bowl eligibility.
Well, that's true. Different levels of meaningful. NC State at North Carolina next Saturday. That's going to be pretty meaningful for NC State and for North Carolina because you get a chance to maybe end the season of your rival a lot earlier than they would have liked. Roddy Jones, our Formula One analyst, he'll be on Wake Forest and Miami coming up this week. That didn't make my top 10. I apologize for that. I know.
Hopefully next week we'll make it.
Well, now that
F1
F1 is in, I had to kick the Wake Miami game out.
There we go. A fair trade, honestly. I support that.
At Roddy Jones 20 on Twitter. Thank you very much, my man. I'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Adam. See you.
You got it. Roddy Jones here.